welcome back for week 4, or I should say lecture 4, the last week of my little run through American society and culture. From before the Civil War up to the eve of World War II. This time around, I really have tried to just focus on kind of the way people lived, some of the things they were thinking about, some of the ways they worked or entertained themselves. So I have talked about the 1930s before with a focus on the New Deal and all the political changes that happened in the 1930s. But today is really just about the society and the culture. So that may be the last reference to Franklin Roosevelt I make, so which is okay. All right. So back to the little list of where today's topics are. And Robin, when you have a chance to turn the lights off, that'd be great. Now we'll see what happens. Ooh. Ah, lovely. Okay, I hope that works for people. All right, so we need the Depression itself. What happened to the economy in 1929? What everybody remembers, and as well they should, is what happened to the stock market. The 1920s was an amazing decade for the stock market. The Dow Jones average there, as you can see, really soars. The Dow Jones average went up 50%. That's 50% in 1 year, 1928. It went up another 25% in the first half of 1929. Part of that was fueled by an amazing amount of lending. Basically, if you wanted to buy stock, you didn't have to have all the money for the purchase price. You could borrow from your broker. And brokers and banks were lending millions of dollars to ordinary people so that they could buy stock. The brokers' loans in just the last 5 years of the decade went from less than $2 million total to $8.5 million, which bought you a lot of stock back then. A lot of people were buying stock with money they did not have. In the summer of 1929, some people started to get worried. The story is that Joseph P. Kennedy, Democratic fundraiser and stock speculator extraordinaire, he came home in the summer of 1929. He told Rose that the kid shining his shoes had just given him a stock tip. And he figured if we're down to that, this might be a time to get out because things could be a little bit unstable. On September 3rd, 1929, the Dow Jones hit, it sounds like small potatoes, it hit all of 386, which was a huge number at the time, and as it turned out, it wouldn't get back to that number for 25 years. On October 16th, 1929, the Dow Jones went down a little bit, closed at 336. The nation's most famous economist, Professor Irving Fisher at Yale University, and he really was a well-known and well-respected economist. So on October 16th, he tells the New York Times that as far as he can see, stock prices have reached, quote, what looks like a permanently high plateau. He expected to see the stock market a good deal higher than it is today within just a few months. Poor Professor Fisher was completely wrong, and his reputation has suffered ever since. On October 19th, 1929, President Hoover asked Thomas Lamont, who worked at the J.P. Morgan Bank, whether he should be worried about the stock market. And Lamont said, the future appears brilliant. Checking the stock prices had become a national obsession. Even for lots of people who didn't actually own stocks, it was a spectator sport. And following what the big stocks like General Electric or RCA had done was something a lot of people enjoyed doing. And so there you see crowds. You could watch the ticker tape come out at your stockbrokers. They printed the stock prices in the paper several times a day. You could have somebody read that to the crowd. I mean, look, there's just kids there, but they're all having fun hearing what the stock prices are doing. Until Wednesday, October 23rd, 1929. So that's 4 days after Lamont said everything's brilliant. The stock market plunged 6%, which at the time was the biggest daily loss ever. One journalist called it a perfect Niagara Falls of liquidation. Professor Fisher blamed a lunatic fringe of reckless speculators. 6 million shares were traded. So for some, apparently anxiety was building. And on that particular day, a lot of people thought, well, maybe we should start to get out. And once prices start falling, if you don't, the people who have bought on margin are required to put up more money before the stock disappears. So lots of margin calls went out. You're going to have to put up more money or we're going to seize your stock. Leading up to Black Thursday, October 24th, a stampede of selling. Go back first. Those are I couldn't figure out how to do the slides. Those are the crowds outside on Black Thursday, wondering what's happening inside the exchange. The place was falling apart, said one trader. At lunchtime, the top bankers in the country met at JP Morgan's and they agreed to pump money into the market to the tune of $130 million. So that afternoon, the vice president of the exchange walks onto the floor of the exchange and bids $205 for U.S. steel, which had fallen below 200. That kind of suggestion that the bankers aren't worried sparked a rally. And so for the day, it only was down, the market was only down 2%. There was so much trading that they closed the day at 3 and the ticker tape was still processing things 4 hours later. Nearly 13 million shares were traded, which was 5 million more than the previous record. President Hoover went to the press and announced that the fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis. On that same day, there were 11 suicides by well-known New York stock speculators. Now, on Friday, amazingly, the stock market went up a little bit. And so some people claimed that they weren't worried. Alfred Sloan at General Motors said that the sell-off on Wednesday and Thursday was a healthy thing. It had to come sooner or later, and it's better that it's over now. Now everyone will just get back to work. And the Wall Street Journal said the storm has left no wreckage except marginal traders forced to sell the loss. So the authorities weren't worried, but somehow, and I don't pretend to understand mob psychology or investor psychology, but somehow over the weekend, a whole lot of people weren't listening to the experts and started planning to get out. And Monday morning, the sell-off started the instant the bell rang. Over 9 million shares traded. The stock market fell 13% in one day, twice the record that was only set the previous Wednesday. Now, if you'll notice one of those headlines, as like on the Boston Daily Globe, bankers prepare to check. The assumption was the bankers will bail us out. They solve things on Thursday. There's enough money there. They will come to the rescue again. And so, the press was trying to be optimistic, but it turned out that the bankers had run out of extra funds to pump into the stock market. Chaos on the floor of the exchange. Imagine that poor guy on the right there. He has to sweep it all up. You can see all the paper. The selling continues on Tuesday, which, of course, at this point, everything's being named black. So, Black Tuesday. One reporter wrote that every consideration was set aside except getting rid of a stock at any price. Groucho Marx got a call from a very good friend of his who also happened to be his stockbroker. And the broker says, "Marx, the jig is up." Marx then later said, "I lost $240,000. I would have lost more, but that was all the money I had." The Dow Jones fell another 12% on Tuesday, second worst day ever. The record, 16 million shares traded. That record lasted for 40 years. Then, according to the New York Times, from every point of view, in the extent of losses sustained, in total turnover, in the number of speculators wiped out, The day was the most disastrous in Wall Street's history. Hysteria swept the country. So the stock market had lost 30% in 1 week, which had obviously never happened before. But that was really just the beginning, because plenty of people followed the stock market, but overall, not that many Americans had money in the stock market. But what follows, and I'm not an expert in psychology, I'm certainly not an economist either, so I don't pretend to quite understand this, but you have what builds up after the stock market crash and continues for the next several years, a sort of spiraling thing where, all right, banks call in loans, investors have to pony up or lose their stocks, businesses have to repay their loans to the bank. How do they do that? Well, they have to cut costs. How do businesses cut costs? Well, they start cutting wages, they start laying people off, they start producing less, then people start buying less, so then business doesn't need to produce as much. Things keep going in a sort of circle. I found that lovely. I did not create that. I actually found that on the internet, the deflationary spiral. But I hope it gives you some idea. Over and over, businesses and consumers keep cutting back, which causes another cycle. By 1933, the gross national product was down 44%. The official unemployment rate was 25%, but the government didn't keep good records back then. And there are pretty reliable suggestions that unemployment was 50% in industrial places like Cleveland and Detroit. And that doesn't count for people who are only working part-time. One way businesses cut back was to just trim your hours. As an example, in 1929, U.S. Steel had 225,000 full-time workers. In 1933, U.S. Steel had 0 full-time workers. Some numbers by the end of 1932. The stock market just kept going down. And every time Hoover announced things were going to get better, the market went down some more. By 1932, the stock market was down 90%. I mean, we've seen some interesting crashes over the last 50 years, but nothing at this level. Corporations were simply not investing in their plant and operations. Prices are down, wholesale prices down 1/3. For farmers, it's even worse. Family income down 40%. Again, for farmers, it's even worse. But those are numbers, and I want to try to give you some sense of what, these are, and I don't know how old some of you are, and I don't know what you remember or what your parents told you about the decade, but here are some photos to try to help give you some sense of what it was like. I love the little boy, please give my dad a job. And a town, the Chamber of Commerce doesn't want the unemployed coming through. Just keep moving. Bread lines, soup kitchens. Those guys are getting a free lunch, if you can call it. I mean, it is. They didn't have to pay for it, but it wasn't exactly much. And people lost their homes and ended up living in shacks. Those are all improvised houses. Apparently, there was a couple in New York City that found a cave in Central Park and lived in the cave for months. I haven't been to that part of Central Park, but apparently they did. There were whole areas of shacks. And of course, they became known as Hoovervilles. That's the Hooverville in Seattle. So lots of people, mostly men, took off trying to find jobs someplace else. And so riding the rails to get somewhere where there were rumors you could find a job, lots of people were doing that. And things, despite some progress under the New Deal, things got worse, particularly for the nation's farmers because of a drought and the famous Dust Bowl. The original prairie grass that lived out there in the 19th century had deep roots and it could survive almost anything. But when you carve out all the prairie grass and just plant wheat, the roots don't go down very far. And when it gets dry and dry and dry, the topsoil has nothing to hold it and just starts blowing away. And those are dust storms. And that on the lower right, that's what's left of somebody's farm after the dust storm came through. The Dust Bowl triggered the largest migration in American history. 2.5 million people left farms in places like Oklahoma and Kansas and went looking for a better place to be a farmer. Mostly, if they could, went out to California. So you have a lot of people moving and taking everything with them. If you didn't have a car, you have people walking. And there's some more faces. You gotta love, I don't know if you probably can't read it, so I'll tell you. I love the guy with the apples. All right, so an apple 5 cents, but the small print says Canadian money not accepted. Children. My parents were fortunate. They lived in a small town in upstate New York, and one grandfather was an electrical contractor and managed to keep work, and the other was a lawyer who got paid in bushels of corn and things like that when his clients ran out of money. So my parents didn't suffer in the way some of those children no doubt did. Families. The man with his children in the upper left there, they've just been evicted from their home, so he's standing outside the house with what's left of their belongings. And then two of the most famous photos of the Depression. I don't know that anyone recorded the name of that sharecropper, the man on the left, but he has a marvelous face. The photo on the right is maybe the most famous photograph taken during the Depression. Dorothea Lange traveled the country documenting what was happening to ordinary people. And that woman is Florence Owens Thompson. She was a Cherokee by background, came from Oklahoma, and then was a migrant worker out in California where she had her picture taken. She was a mother of 7. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but she's 32. And she does not look 32 to me. But think of what she'd had to do trying to feed 7 children in the midst of all that. Now, the hard times during the Depression caused some fundamental changes in how people behaved. There we go. One thing that happened is people postponed getting married. The number of marriages was pretty steady during the 20s, plummets during 29 to 33, and then bounces back rather nicely as the Depression continues, but gets somewhat better later in the 30s. People also postponed getting divorced because apparently if you were a husband with children, you had a better chance of getting government relief if you were married. If you were just a single man, your chances of getting government relief were much lower. So both the marriage and divorce rate went down about 25%. Come back here. The birth rate also. The birth rate had been going down anyway during the comfortable 20s as people decided that children cost a lot and you could have a nicer lifestyle without quite so many children. But then for a different practical reason, a lot of people postponed having children during the early 30s. It turns out that a lot of people were using birth control. Sales of birth control hit 250 million in 1938. According to Fortune magazine, birth control was one of the most prosperous industries in the country during the Great Depression. Condom manufacturers produced 1.5 million of the little guys every day. You could get them for $1 a dozen. There were machines available. Birth control was illegal in lots and lots of places. But if you knew where to look, you could find them at gasoline vending machines. You could order them by mail. The most common form of birth control appears to have been what were known at the time as feminine hygiene products. And that's an advertisement for one. That woman is looking nervous. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, doomsday. Lysol is advertising a disinfectant there. And it is a douche, and it says it will protect a woman from, quote, calendar fear, that's a quote, by destroying, here's another direct quote, hidden germ life. Okay. I have no idea whether that worked, but they were advertising it, so good Lord. Anyway, one other big social change of the early 30s was the end of Prohibition. The political opposition had mounted during the late 20s. In February 1933, Congress passed an amendment to repeal the 18th Amendment, and the 21st Amendment went into effect at the end of 1933, and you can see some very happy people there. Happy days are beer again. They take off on the Roosevelt campaign song. Okay. Styles, pastimes, some of the things to sort of set what did the decade look like. The great style, the thing that we still remember that epitomizes the 1930s, was known as Art Deco. And there are still some wonderful books available to tell you about it. It was a style developed in Paris around World War I, spread during the 20s, and then really took off here in the 30s. It emphasized luxury and glamour and technology, and it made use of things, materials that hadn't existed before, like chrome plating and stainless steel and plastic. You can find Art Deco in all sorts of settings. So classic buildings. I mean, is that not one of the greatest buildings ever made, the Chrysler Building? I just think that thing is so cool. And they replicated the spire of it on the elevators there, as you can see. Another example is Rockefeller Center. But between the sculpture and the architecture of the building, even the elevators are glitzy. I mean, escalators. Radio City Music Hall. And just some of the decorations, the sculpture outside of the buildings. That's the Fisher Body building in Detroit. That's their lobby, which sort of looks like a Ottoman Empire palace inside. Some examples in Boston of Art Deco. The McCormick Federal Building down on Post Office Square. Not nearly as spiffy as the ones I showed you from New York, but it does date from this period. Right around the corner is the New England Telephone Building, also on Post Office Square, which some of you may recognize. The Hat Shell. The Hat Shell is an Art Deco design. And that's the Nantasket Beach House down on the bottom there. One of the best places to see Art Deco styles was the movies. The sets. Some of the sets are just staggering. That is somebody's living room from a movie called Our Modern Maidens, 1929. I think the movie's forgettable, but the set's pretty cool. That's the lobby of Grand Hotel, movie from 1932. Who lived there? Nick and Nora Charles in the Thin Man movies. That's their living room. And then there's a bedroom for you. That's Jean Harlow in Dinner at 8. Even the theaters. Some of the theaters were masterpieces. That's the Paramount Theater in Oakland that has survived and is just amazing. The Warner Grand Theater in San Pedro, California. And a few other marvelous ones. I mean, look at that Mayan thing. That is in Denver. I don't know what they were thinking, but they were having fun. Going to the movies was one of the most popular things you could do during the 1930s, and we'll come back to what some of the movies were a little later. But you didn't even need a movie theater. You could go to the drive-in. That, friends, is the first drive-in theater. It opened in Camden, New Jersey in 1933. It's like 25 cents a car to get in. People went to lots of spectator sports in the 1930s. Baseball attendance dropped in the first few years of the Depression because people just were pinching their pennies. But the attendance bounced back later in the decade, and some of the stars of the 1930s are Mel Ott. Mel Ott in the upper left there, he led the New York Giants to a World Series win. Dizzy Dean in the upper right, he led the St. Louis Cardinals to a win. Joe DiMaggio in the lower left, he joined the Yankees in 1936, and they won 5 straight World Series. But probably the most dramatic moment in baseball in the 1930s was the departure of Lou Gehrig. There he is at the microphone. He, one of the greatest players of the 20s and 30s, as you probably all know, he came down with ALS, which still sometimes is called Lou Gehrig's disease. It started affecting his play very rapidly in 1939, and so he took himself out of the lineup for the first time in 2,000 games. And later in the summer, he had a retirement ceremony at Yankee Stadium, and he said, "For the past 2 weeks, you have been reading about a bad break. Yet today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth." But he died 2 years later, and he was only 38. Actually, it was a week before his birthday. One of the other sports you could watch, the NFL was not the primetime event that it is today, but it did get organized, and the NFL, as we know it, had its first championship game in 1933. The Bears beat the Giants. The teams were lucky to get 25,000 people in the stands. And you will notice they don't have face masks, face guards, or anything. They are just whacking each other. There were 10 teams in 1939, and for those of you who are interested, there was the Brooklyn Dodgers, a franchise that doesn't exist anymore, but the Chicago Bears, the Chicago Cardinals, who at the moment I think are in Arizona, the Cleveland Rams, who are now in LA, the Detroit Lions, the Green Bay Packers, the New York Giants, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Pittsburgh Pirates, who are now known as the Steelers, and the Washington Redskins, who are now the Commanders. But still, little did they know that the NFL would be the powerhouse that it is today. What else did people do during the 30s? Jigsaw puzzles became a craze. People did lots and lots of them. Bridge. Bridge was another craze. People played lots and lots of bridge and had bridge leagues, tournaments. It was a great way for people to get together. And new board games. Parker Brothers brought us Monopoly, 1935, Sorry, 1934, and even Parcheesi, 1938, which is apparently a royal game of India, at least according to the box. Okay, it was an interesting and good decade for American literature. Some of the authors I talked about the last time were continuing to write some impressive stuff. F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night, which is a barely disguised account of his marriage with Zelda. Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, which was a barely disguised account of what would happen if America had a Hitler. Some things don't change. No, I didn't say that. I'm sorry. Hemingway wrote some of his best stuff, and particularly William Faulkner wrote some of his most amazing work. But there were some new authors who really got most of the headlines, and one of them was Pearl Buck. Her parents were Presbyterian missionaries in China. She married a missionary. She taught English in Chinese universities. And then she started writing, and The Good Earth was the best-selling novel in both 1931 and 1932. And it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1932. She kept writing, and she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1938. Another new author was John Steinbeck. He was raised in Salinas, in California. He grew up in that house. Lived near Monterey. His first success was Tortilla Flats, followed with books like Of Mice and Men. The Grapes of Wrath was the best-selling book of 1939 and won the Pulitzer Prize. He went on, continued writing. In 1962, Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Somebody asked him if he thought he deserved the Nobel Prize, and he said, frankly, no. So, interesting honesty. Perhaps the most successful author, well, Pearl Buck was really darn successful, but otherwise, Margaret Mitchell. She grew up in a well-to-do family in Atlanta, was raised on a steady diet of family stories about the South before the Civil War and the evils of Reconstruction. She married a man who turned out to be an alcoholic. She had to support herself, so she got a job at the Atlanta Journal and was a journalist. That's how she made her living. She was also an avid reader. She read all sorts of things. She had a fondness for classical pornography. Apparently, she was a big fan of Fanny Hill, Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, from 18th century England. Good, go figure. And she spent 2 years in that house writing Gone with the Wind. She showed it to an editor at Macmillan. The guy thought, this might sell. And it was the best-selling novel of both 1936 and 1937. Every year, she donated some of the money she made to Atlanta's Morehouse College, which was for the training of black medical students. People also read a lot of mysteries in the 1930s. Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and I had not realized this, but series that I know I grew up with, at least one of them, the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew first appeared in the 1930s. Oh, stop. My phone's talking to me. After mentioning to you to quiet your phone, I forgot to do that myself. Siri is saying, I didn't get that. Could you try again? Shush. All right. Now, the 30s were the golden age of radio. There were more than 700 stations nationwide. They were churning out 11 million radios every year. People listened more than 4 hours a day. And you had lots of choices. That's an excerpt from a newspaper account of what's available on a Monday night. I think in that case it's from Seattle. So you have lots and lots of shows in 15 or 30-minute increments. One of the genres was the soap opera. And I have to slow down a bit because these things are just too good to pass up. All right, so the woman on the upper left there is Ann Elstner, who played Stella Dallas. The true life story of mother love and sacrifice, in which Stella Dallas saw her own beloved daughter Laurel marry into wealth and society, and realizing the differences in their tastes and worlds went out of Laurel's life. But she didn't actually. In one episode, she braved a dust storm in the Sahara desert to rescue her daughter Stella, who had been taken by a sheik, and he had imprisoned her in a harem. The woman in the middle, on the upper level, is Vivian Friedel, who played Mary Noble, Backstage Wife. Now we present once again Backstage Wife, the story of Mary Noble, a little Iowa girl who married one of America's most handsome actors, Larry Noble, matinee idol of a million other women. The story of what it means to be the wife of a famous star. Julie Stevens, on the upper right there, played Helen Trent. Helen Trent, the story of a woman who sets out to prove what so many other women long to prove in their own lives, that romance can live at 35 and even beyond. Direct quote. Okay, on the lower left, you have Dorothy Lowell, who played our gal Sunday. The story that asked the question, can an orphan from the little mining town of Silver Creek, Colorado, find happiness as the wife of Lord Henry Brinthrope, England's richest and most handsome lord? Much calmer was the people on the lower right there. The older woman is Virginia Payne playing Ma Perkins, who was identified as America's mother of the air and lived in a small town called Rushville Center. The soap operas appeared every single day in 15-minute increments. But I guess they could cram a lot of excitement into 15 minutes. Now, of course, it was also a decade for some amazing comedy. George Burns and Gracie Allen. They had started in vaudeville together. That's them in the lower left in their vaudeville days. They got their own radio show in 1934. One of their running gags was how Gracie was trying to find her brother. Her brother always kept getting lost. And apparently so many people were looking for her brother that her real brother went into hiding. Another star was Fred Allen, actually born in, not so far away, born in Cambridge as John Sullivan. As a youngster, he worked at the Boston Public Library. But then he got into vaudeville, and he ended up getting his own radio show in 1932. One of his running gags was a feud he was having with Jack Benny. And I remember listening to one of their episodes where somehow Benny comes to visit him on the episode, and by the end of the episode, Benny has lost his pants. And Fred Allen won't give them back. I don't remember how that happened, but there is Benny. He was born in Chicago as Benjamin Kubelski. He played violin in vaudeville orchestras and then also developed comedy routines. His first radio appearance was in 1932 on the Ed Sullivan Radio Hour. And he apparently, this is how he started apparently. This is Jack Benny talking. There will be a slight pause while you say, "Who cares?" I can hear him doing that. He quickly got his own show. But the most popular show of the decade was Amos and Andy. The men playing the characters were Freeman Gosden, played Amos, Charles Correll played Andy, and they did it all as black people speaking with a heavy, supposedly comical dialect. It ran every night from 1928 to 1942. At one point, the characters moved from Georgia to Chicago. They bought a car that didn't have a windshield, and so they operated it as the Fresh Air Taxi Company. They also belonged to a social group called the Mystic Knights of the Sea, and one of the characters in the club apparently coined the expression "holy mackerel." I didn't know that. You could get a lot of classical music on the radio. NBC had its own orchestra with Arturo Toscanini. And then, of course, you had adventure shows. The Lone Ranger. So you have to imagine the William Tell Overture for yourselves. A fiery horse with the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty "Hi-yo, Silver!" The Lone Ranger. There you go. Whoops, come back here. Okay, that was on 3 nights a week. There was the Green Hornet. They featured a character, I don't know if you can see it in the ad, The Adventures of the Hornet, a character who was identified as Kato the Jap Butler, but actually played by a real Japanese man, which for the standards of the time was probably enlightened. The Shadow, a series of mystery shows, and for one year, The Shadow was voiced by Orson Welles. And of course, you can't talk about radio in the 1930s without Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds. Okay, so Welles and his friends have a regular show called the Mercury Theater of the Air. And they did weekly adaptations of famous books like Around the World in 80 Days. They would do things like that. So on one night, they announced without any fanfare at all, that they're going to do H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. and then they immediately move on. And unless you heard that, you didn't know what was about to happen. So then they cut to a weather report. Then they play some orchestra music, and then they interrupt with news flashes. And at first, there are gas explosions on Mars. What could that mean? And then they go back to the music. They go back to some more news flashes. Then they come on and announce that a meteorite has landed in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, which happened to be a real town in Mercer County. People are looking out their windows. It climaxed with a live report from the top of their radio station building in Manhattan about how crowds are fleeing from aliens dispensing poison gas, and people are, quote, dropping like flies. While this was happening, the police are trying to get into the studio to stop them, and CBS executives are barring the door to prevent the police from getting in. The newspapers reported a mass panic. Historians sometimes take the fun out of everything, and apparently there's an actual academic debate about how many people panicked. And it may be that there weren't as many people panicking as the press initially said. But I like radio play terrifies nation. I mean, why not? A serious note, this sounds really ridiculous, but this was 1 month after the Munich conference, where it looked for us, it looked for quite a while like Europe was about to go to war, and the Munich conference appeared to have settled things down, but people were on edge in October 1939. I think there's probably some link there between how people reacted and what was going on in the real world. Now, it is a great decade for music. The same people I talked about last time are still churning out amazing stuff. Irving Berlin, look at Putting on the Ritz, Cheek to Cheek, I've Got My Love to Keep Me Warm, a great song. Easter Parade, George and Ira Gershwin. Their opera Porgy and Bess in 1935 had Summertime, It Ain't Necessarily So, and I Got Plenty of Nothing. They also managed to write They Can't Take That Away From Me and Our Love Is Here to Stay. George Gershwin died of a brain tumor in 1937, and he was only 38. It's hard to imagine what else he could have written. The other big songwriter of the decade was Cole Porter. Every one of those musicals that I've got the playbills for had songs like the New Yorkers had Love for Sale. Guy Divorcé had Night and Day. Anything Goes, beside the title, had I Get a Kick Out of You and You're the Top. Jubilee had Just One of Those Things. And even Leave It to Me, which I had never heard of, but that had My Heart Belongs to Daddy. I mean, that's some great stuff. The sound, and I played you some samples before we got started, the sound that really symbolized the decade for a lot of people was the big band, which were referred to as orchestras at the time. And there you've got Duke Ellington's group. They made a lot of records, traveled the world, made songs like In a Sentimental Mood and Take the A Train. Count Basie, a producer named John Hammond, who I believe is the same person who discovered Bob Dylan. John Hammond, I think that's true. In any event, Count Basie, Hammond heard them on the radio, invited them to New York to record, and they became the house band at the Woodside Hotel and then the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. Benny Goodman. He was the 9th of 12 children of Russian immigrants in Chicago. He took clarinet lessons at the local synagogue. He joined the Musicians Union and went out supporting himself playing in a band at the age of 14. His band started getting regular radio performances in 1935. So there's the band, but he gets a lot of credit because in 1936, he appeared on stage with a quartet. And he's got Gene Krupa, who is an amazing drummer, but Krupa's white. The other two people in the band are black. He hires Teddy Wilson to play piano and Lionel Hampton to play vibes. It was the first time black musicians and white musicians appeared on stage together. in any kind of large setting. Somebody once said to him, "Boy, you were brave to do that." And he said, "I never thought it was brave. That was the way it was supposed to be. How can you play if you're going to worry about a guy's color? It's hard enough just to play." And actually, though, the most popular band of the decade was Glenn Miller. He sold more records than anybody else in 1939, 1940. Joined the Army in 1942 to play for the troops in Europe. His plane disappeared over France in December 1944. So he was lost. When people weren't listening to the radio, they were going to the movies. And by 1930, so movie attendance was 90 million people every week. The country as a whole had 125 million people. 90 out of 125. Now, some people are going multiple times, but each week. But that is a remarkable level of attendance. Now, attendance dropped as the Depression sank in. People stopped buying as many tickets. Sales went down 30% in 1931. So the studios resorted, how are you going to bring people back to the theaters? The studios resorted to sensationalism. What do you need? What's still the formula? Violence and sex. Gangster films. The studios made dozens of gangster films. Warner Brothers in particular specialized in them. There you have Edward G. Robinson playing Al Capone. There you have James Cagney in The Public Enemy. And one of the famous movie moments of the decade, he is smashing a grapefruit in the face of Mae Clark because she said something that annoyed him. Beside gangster movies, there were monster movies, creature features. And every one of those movies appeared in just the window between 1931 and 1933, where they're trying to get people to come back to the studios, or back to the theaters. Frankenstein? Dracula? Remember, there's no code of standards yet. And so they're pumping out the violence. Will Hayes was the man they put in charge. He was the face of the code. He had been the Postmaster General of the United States. And movies had to have that seal of approval. Here are some highlights from what the code did. No picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Brutal killings are not to be presented in detail. The sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld. Excessive and lustful kissing, lustful embraces, suggestive postures and gestures are not to be shown. Sex perversion or any inference of it is forbidden. That was their code for homosexuality, which just simply couldn't be acknowledged that it even existed. According to the code, miscegenation, sex relationships between people with different races, was forbidden. Obscenity in word, gesture, reference, song, joke, or even suggestion was forbidden. Undressing scenes should be avoided. And dances which emphasize indecent movements are to be regarded as obscene. So the code had some immediate practical effects. They were making a new Tarzan movie. They had planned to have a nude swimming scene with a body double for Maureen O'Sullivan. That scene was cut. When Alfred Hitchcock made Rebecca, some of you have probably seen that movie, they had to rewrite the plot to avoid any suggestion that the narrator's husband might have gotten away with killing his first wife, which kind of takes away from the whole plot of the movie. And in Casablanca, there originally was a conversation between Rick and Ilsa, which made it very clear that they had slept together in Paris. Those lines came out. Now, despite the production code, Hollywood made some amazing movies in the 1930s. I want to give you some flashes. Charlie Chaplin was still at it. City Lights, there he is in the middle of a factory. The Great Dictator, he's pretending to be Hitler. There's another guy who pretends to be Mussolini, and they have a hilarious interview where they keep trying to one-up each other. But he also does a poetic dance with that globe. Have people seen this movie? Any of you? It's gorgeous. He's just dancing with. He's in love with the globe. It's really marvelous. The Marx Brothers. What were known in the trade as screwball comedies. Like It Happened One Night. That's at the top there. That's Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. Bringing Up Baby, in which Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant have an unusual child, or whatever baby is there. And on the lower right, you have You Can't Take It With You, which is includes an amazing cast, including a young Jimmy Stewart and Ann Miller. There were lots of musicals. Some of them had giant production numbers, like The Gold Diggers of 1933, which was staged by Busby Berkeley, and The Ziegfeld Follies. Some of the musicals had plots as an excuse to link the dance scenes together. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. I recently rewatched Top Hat, which is just gorgeous. Anyway, I'm a sucker for this old black and white stuff. And I want to close the discussion of movies with 1939, which is really an astounding year. In just that one year, John Ford made Stagecoach, which I guess is considered by many critics the best Western movie ever made. Goodbye, Mr. Chips, for which Robert Donat won the Oscar. Frank Capra made Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The Women, Norma Shearer and Joan Crawford duking it out. That is a marvelous movie. And then you had more movies like a young Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. Hey kids, let's put on a show. Babes in Arms. And then, of course, the most popular movie of 1939. This is apparently, adjusted for inflation, this is the highest grossing movie of all time. It actually has made more money than Star Wars or Titanic. Again, accounting for inflation. It won 8 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director for Victor Fleming, Best Actress for Vivian Leigh, and Best Supporting Actress for Hattie McDaniel. Her parents had been slaves. During the 20s, she sang on a separate black vaudeville circuit. In the 30s, she broke into movies playing the only part a black woman could get in the 1930s. She was a maid. She was always a maid. She sang a song in the 1936 movie Showboat. And then, she's just fabulous in Gone with the Wind. She could not attend the premiere of the movie in Atlanta because it was a whites-only theater. At the Oscars ceremony in Los Angeles, she and the other black people had to sit at a segregated table against the wall. She didn't get to sit with the rest of the people from Gone with the Wind. When she died of breast cancer in 1952, she had wanted to be buried in Hollywood Cemetery, but Hollywood Cemetery was whites only at the time, so she couldn't. She was buried in the Rosedale Cemetery. She got the award, which is an amazing thing, but the society was still pretty backward in other respects. And then there's the other greatest movie of 1939, The Wizard of Oz. And so I like to close with, again, I am a hopeless romantic, and so I'm going to close with what may be the most beautiful song I have ever heard.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that on a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me, somewhere over the rainbow. Bluebirds fly over the rainbow. Why then, oh, why can't I? If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh, why can't I?
Beyond everything else, the dog is perfect. Just a little paw thing. Ugh. Okay, so the last lecture will be on Friday at 1:30. I want to send you all out of here in a happy mood with Benny Goodman. And thanks, stay safe.